A powerful CEO finds an abandoned baby in his luxury car with just a note saying he's in danger. But when he gets home with the child, he discovers a surprise party full of important guests waiting for him, and the secret behind this baby will change his life forever. Comment what you think will happen to this millionaire and subscribe to the channel to support my work. It was a cold winter night when Tony Mendez parked his luxurious car in the garage of the Plaza Hotel after an exhausting business meeting. The 45-year-old CEO adjusted his bespoke Italian suit and grabbed his leather briefcase, eager to get home after a long day. The echo of his polished shoes reverberated through the empty parking garage as he walked towards the elevator. That's when he heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the direction of his car. Tony stopped, frowning. In his 20 years building an empire from the ground up, he had learned to trust his gut. And at that moment, something felt wrong. He retraced his steps, approaching the vehicle again. The sound grew louder. It was a faint cry, as if someone was trying to stifle it. His heart quickened as he pressed the remote, popping the trunk. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. Swaddled in a light blue blanket was a baby, no more than a few months old. The child looked up at him with big, watery brown eyes, rosy, cheeks wet with tears. Tony froze, his mind trying to process the surreal scene before him. In all his years dealing with tough negotiations and complex situations, nothing had prepared him for this. He glanced around the empty garage, but there was no sign of anyone. With hands trembling slightly, he picked up a small, folded piece of paper that was next to the baby. The message was short and direct. "Take care of him. He's in danger." Before he could recover from the shock, his cell phone rang, making him jump. The number was unknown. "Hello?" he answered, his voice firmer than he felt. "Stay away from that baby." The voice on the other end was distorted, metallic and threatening. Tony felt a chill run down his spine, but years of hard-nosed deals had taught him not to show fear. "Who is this?" The call ended abruptly, leaving only the silence of the parking garage and the soft cries of the baby. He looked again at the child. The baby had stopped crying and was now staring at him with an expression that seemed almost hopeful. Tony Mendez, the man known in the business world for his coldness and ruthless determination, felt something stir inside him. Without thinking twice, he scooped the baby up in his arms, surprised by the naturalness with which the child snuggled against his chest. It was a strange sensation. He had never held a baby before. He had always avoided any contact with children, a reflection of the traumas of his own childhood that he preferred to keep buried in the past. "What am I going to do with you?" he murmured, more to himself than to the baby. The obvious answer would be to call the cops, but something in the message made him hesitate. He's in danger. If that were true, handing the child over to the authorities could put him in even greater risk. He made his decision. He would take the baby to his mansion and then decide what to do. It was risky, but his gut rarely led him astray in business. He carefully placed the child in the back seat of the car, improvising a support with his own jacket. Throughout the drive to his house, Tony couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, checking to see if the baby was okay. The child had fallen asleep, his soft breathing the only sound inside the luxury vehicle. When he finally arrived at the gates of his estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, he noticed something strange. There were several cars parked in the driveway, and all the lights in the mansion were on, which was unusual for that hour. His heart leaped when he saw the banner hanging at the entrance. "Happy birthday, Tony." With horror, he remembered that it was his 45th birthday. Helen, his estranged wife, must have organized a surprise party. He could see through the windows that the house was full of people, his business partners, family members, and even some local reporters who often covered high society events. The baby chose that moment to wake up, letting out a small whimper. Tony looked desperately at the child and then at his brightly lit mansion. How would he explain the presence of a baby in his car? The rumors would spread like wildfire in a matter of minutes. The sound of footsteps approaching the car made his heart jump. Through the glass, he saw Helen walking towards him with a forced smile on her lips, wearing an elegant red dress. Behind her, a group of guests approached, all curious to see his reaction to the surprise. The baby began to stir restlessly, threatening to cry. Tony held his breath, knowing that in the next few seconds his life would change completely. Helen reached the car window just as the baby let out a piercing cry. The artificial smile on her face vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of shock and confusion. Through the glass, her eyes met the small figure wrapped in the back seat. "Tony, what is this?" she hissed through her teeth, maintaining a forced smile for the approaching guests. Before he could answer, Brittany Sterling, his ex-girlfriend and current society columnist for the town's leading newspaper, was already at Helen's side, her cell phone in hand. The journalist's eyes gleamed as she recognized the baby. "So the rumors were true?" Brittany asked, her falsely sweet tone barely hiding the malice. "Does the powerful Anthony Mendez have a secret child?" "It's not what it looks like," Tony replied dryly, but the baby's crying was getting louder. The guests began to crowd around the car, whispering and pointing. Helen yanked open the passenger door. "Get out of the car now, Tony, we need to talk." Her voice trembled with contained rage. He knew he had no choice. Carefully, he picked up the baby in his arms, trying to soothe him. The little one clung to his shirt, stopping crying almost immediately. The innocent gesture caused a wave of ohs and ahs among the guests, followed by more whispers and the unmistakable sound of photos being taken. "Let's go inside," Helen commanded, her voice icy. "Everyone, please give us a moment." But it was too late. Brittany was already typing furiously on her cell phone, and Tony could practically see the headline forming. His reputation, built over decades of hard work, was about to crumble. In the study, Helen slammed the door hard enough to make the paintings on the wall rattle. "Explain yourself," she demanded. "I found the baby in the trunk of my car," Tony began, realizing how ridiculous the story sounded. "There was a note saying he's in danger." Helen laughed humorlessly. "You expect me to believe that, after all the lies during our marriage?" "It's the truth," he insisted, adjusting the baby who had fallen asleep in his arms. "I got a threatening call right after I found him. And your solution was to bring him home. To the party I spent weeks organizing, trying to salvage what's left of our marriage." Guilt hit Tony like a punch to the gut. Helen was right. Even with the divorce proceedings underway, she was still trying to fix things, and he had just completely destroyed that possibility. A gentle knock on the door interrupted the argument. It was Rose, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 20 years. "Excuse me," she said timidly, "but I think the baby needs to be changed, and he must be hungry too." Helen ran her hands over her face in exasperation. "Great, now we have to take care of my husband's love child." "He's not my son," Tony protested, but his voice faltered as he looked at the serene face of the sleeping baby. "Let me help," Rose offered, reaching out to take the child. But as soon as she tried to take him from Tony, the baby woke up and started crying desperately. "No, no," Tony found himself saying, gently rocking the little one. "It's okay. It's okay." To his surprise, the baby calmed down immediately at the sound of his voice. Helen watched the scene with an unreadable expression. "You never wanted children," she said quietly. "For 10 years of marriage, that was your one certainty. And now—" "Mum," Rose interrupted gently. "The guests are waiting, and photos are already circulating on social media." As if to confirm her words, Tony's cell phone began to ring incessantly. They were messages from his partners, friends, and even his lawyer. "Go," he said to Helen. "Take care of the guests. I'll handle this." "Handle it how, Tony? Your journalist. Ex-girlfriend is out there. She's probably already published the story. Tomorrow the whole country will think you've been hiding an illegitimate child." As if things couldn't get any worse, there was another knock on the door. It was George, his personal assistant, with a worried look on his face. "Mr. Mendez, sorry to interrupt, but Ms. Sophia is here." Tony felt the blood drain from his face. Sophia was his younger sister, whom he hadn't spoken to in 5 years, due to a bitter family feud. What was she doing here? Sophia entered without waiting for permission, her heels clicking firmly on the marble floor. She stopped when she saw the baby in her brother's arms, and a strange expression crossed her face. "So it's true," she said, her voice laden with an emotion that Tony couldn't identify. "The baby is with you." Something in the way she said that made everyone in the room freeze. Sophia knew something. "What do you know about this?" Tony asked, his authoritative businessman tone returning automatically. Sophia approached, slowly, her eyes fixed on the baby. "That birthmark on his neck, it's the same as yours." Tony adjusted the baby in his arms and for the first time noticed the small crescent-shaped mark on the child's neck, identical to his own mark, which he had always considered unique. "How did you know?" he started to ask, but was interrupted by the shrill sound of his cell phone. It was the same unknown number as before. Sophia paled when she saw the number on the screen. "Don't answer it," she said quickly. "Please, Tony, not yet." Helen looked from one to the other, confused. "What's going on here? Do you two know something about this baby?" The cell phone continued to ring, its sound growing louder and more threatening. The baby began to stir, sensing the tension in the room. Outside, they could hear the murmur of the guests increasing. Sophia took a step forward, her eyes watering. "Tony, there's something you need to know about our family, about why we grew apart, about who this baby is." But before she could continue, the lights in the mansion flickered and went out, plunging everyone into darkness. The baby began to cry, and in the sudden silence, they could hear the distinct sound of footsteps approaching down the hall. The dark, the baby's cries echoed through the walls of the mansion. Rose quickly turned on the flashlight on her cell phone, partially illuminating the study. In the circle of flickering light, Tony could see his sister's tense face, which looked even paler than before. "The generators should have kicked in automatically," Helen whispered, her anger momentarily forgotten in the face of the bizarre situation. "Someone shut them off," Sophia replied, her voice low but firm. "They know the baby is here." The footsteps in the hall grew closer, heavy and determined. Tony instinctively squeezed the baby against his chest, feeling his small heart beating fast. The child, surprisingly, had stopped crying and was now clinging to him as if his life depended on it. "Who are they, Sophia?" Tony demanded, keeping his voice controlled despite the tension. "What do you know about all this?" Before Sophia could answer, the door to the study opened slowly. The light from Rose's flashlight revealed a figure that Tony hadn't seen in years. Matilda, the old housekeeper from his parents' house, who had practically raised him and Sophia after the premature death of their mother. "Matilda!" Helen exclaimed, surprised. "What are you doing here?" The grey-haired lady entered the study with a dignity that her 70 years had not diminished. Her eyes, still sharp as ever, fixed first on the baby in Tony's arms, then on Sophia. "I see you arrived just in time," she said to Sophia, who nodded slightly. "Can someone please explain to me what's going on?" Tony demanded, his patience wearing thin. "How did you know about the baby, Sophia, and what does Matilda have to do with this?" The baby stirred in his arms, letting out a small sigh. Matilda approached, her steps surprisingly steady in the dark. "Let me see the child," she asked, reaching out her arms. For the first time in his life, Tony hesitated to obey an order from Matilda. "Not until you explain what's going on." "Tony," Sophia interjected, her voice trembling slightly, "do you remember why we fought? Why I distanced myself from the family?" "Because you accused our father of hiding secrets about Mom's death," he replied automatically. "Made up absurd theories about hidden documents, about another family." "They weren't theories," Sophia interrupted him. "It was all true, and this baby is the proof." Helen, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly let out a nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous. I'm going out there to calm the guests and call someone to check the generators." "No," Matilda and Sophia said at the same time, but Helen was already opening the door. The hallway was completely dark and silent, eerily silent. There was no more sound of conversation or music coming from the ballroom. "The guests," Helen murmured, confused. "Where is everyone?" Rose, who was still holding the flashlight, pointed the beam of light towards the ballroom. It was completely empty. Half-empty glasses and abandoned appetizer plates were the only signs that people had been there minutes ago. "They're gone," Matilda said calmly. Or rather, they were. "Told to leave. The men who came to get the baby didn't want any witnesses." As if to confirm her words, they heard the sound of tires screeching in the driveway. Tony ran to the window, just in time to see several black SUVs speeding away. "Who are these people?" he asked, feeling fear begin to creep into his usual composure. "Why do they want the baby?" "Because he's the last of the line," Matilda replied, her eyes now fixed on a framed photo on the wall, an old picture of Tony's mother. "The last one who can prove the truth about your family." Sophia approached her brother, gently touching the arm that held the baby. "Remember when we were kids, and you told me about the strange dreams you had? About a different house, other people who seemed like family, but that you had never seen." Tony felt a chill run down his spine. He had never told those dreams to anyone but Sophia. They were confusing memories that had haunted him since childhood. Fragments of a life that didn't seem like his own. "Those weren't dreams," Matilda said softly. "They were memories. Memories that your father worked very hard to make you forget." The baby chose that moment to open his eyes, looking directly at Tony. They were deeply familiar eyes, as if he knew them from somewhere. "This baby," Sophia continued, her voice thick with emotion, "is Clara's son." "Who is Clara?" Helen asked, stepping closer to the group. "Our sister," Sophia replied, without taking her eyes off Tony. "The sister you were forced to forget." The world seemed to spin around Tony. Flashes of memory began to surface in his mind. A girl with dark braids running through the garden, laughter echoing through the halls of a house that wasn't this mansion, an accident, screams, his father shouting, "Orders?" "No." He shook his head, taking a step back. "This isn't possible. It was just the two of us, you and me." "That's what Dad wanted you to believe," Sophia insisted. "After the accident, after Clara disappeared, he did everything to erase any trace of her. Even your memories." "Hypnosis," Matilda added. "Years of manipulated therapy. Your father had enough resources and determination to rewrite the family history." The baby began to stir again, as if sensing Tony's emotional turmoil. Helen stepped closer, placing a hesitant hand on his shoulder. "Tony," she said softly, "look at the baby. Really look. Don't you see?" He looked. The shape of the face, the small, determined chin, the expressive eyes, it was like looking at a baby picture of himself, or of Clara. The memories were coming back now, like a dam breaking. "Clara," he murmured, feeling unexpected tears welling up in his eyes. "My little sister Clara." A noise from the garden startled them. Headlights briefly illuminated the windows of the study. "They're back," Matilda said, her voice urgent. "We need to get you and the baby out of here now." "Where to?" Tony asked, still stunned by the revelations. "To the only safe place," Sophia replied, already moving towards a side door. "To the house where we grew up, the real one." The baby snuggled, closer against Tony's chest, letting out a small yawn. His tiny fist clenched onto the expensive tie, wrinkling the Italian silk. "Helen," Tony turned to his wife, "you don't have to get involved in this. It's dangerous and—" "Don't you dare push me away now," she interrupted him, her voice firm. "This baby may not be your son, but he's your family, and despite everything, you're still my husband." More lights appeared in the garden, and male voices could be heard giving orders. "We don't have much time," Matilda warned, pulling a set of old keys from her pocket. "We have to go before they get in." Tony looked one last time at the study where he had spent so many hours building his empire. None of that seemed important now. The small being in his arms, the last link to a sister who had been erased from his memories, was all that mattered. "Which way?" he asked, his voice regaining its characteristic firmness. Sophia opened the side door, revealing a passageway that Tony had never noticed before. The sound of heavy footsteps was now coming from the main hall. "Trust me, brother," Sophia whispered, reaching out her hand. "It's time for you to remember who you really are." The secret passageway was narrow and damp, illuminated only by the dim light of their cell phones. The smell of earth and mold filled the air as the small group moved forward in silence, guided by Matilda. The baby, surprisingly, remained quiet in Tony's arms, as if he understood the need for silence. "This passageway," Matilda explained in a low voice, "was built over 100 years ago, when your family still owned all the land in the area. It was used in times of conflict." Tony tried to process the information as he walked. Each step seemed to awaken fragments of memory, smells, sounds, sensations that he had buried deep in his mind. Clara's face began to become clearer in his memories, the same determined eyes that he now saw in the baby, the sweet smile, the mischief they used to get into together. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked Sophia, who was walking right behind him. "In all these years." "I tried," she replied, her voice filled with sadness. "Many times, but you always blocked it out, became aggressive, distant. The programming Dad did was very strong." Helen, who had remained silent until then, asked, "And where is Clara now? Why did she leave the baby with Tony?" A heavy silence followed her question. It was Matilda who finally answered. "Clara disappeared 3 days ago. She left the baby with me, saying that Tony was the only one who could protect him. She knew they were coming." "Who are they?" Tony insisted, feeling the baby stir restlessly in his arms. "The same ones who helped your father hide the truth all these years," Sophia explained. "A powerful group that controls much of the business in the area. Clara discovered something about them, something big enough that they wanted to silence her." The tunnel turned a gentle curve, and Tony began to smell a different scent in the air. Wet earth, flowers, a strangely familiar aroma that made his heart race. "We're almost there," Matilda announced, "but I need to warn you, the house is not as you remember it." After a few more yards, they came to an old wooden door. Matilda used one of the keys on her ring to open it, revealing a garden shrouded in the darkness of the night. Tony felt his legs weaken as he took his first step out of the tunnel. The house that stood before them was an old 2-story building, with ivy covering parts of the walls. Even in the dark, even after so many years, it sparked an overwhelming wave of memories in Tony. "Our house," he murmured, feeling unexpected tears in his eyes. "The house where we grew up." The baby chose that moment to let out a small sigh, almost as if he also recognized the place. Helen approached, placing a gentle hand on her husband's back. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer than Tony had heard in months. Before he could answer, a light turned on the second floor of the house. Everyone froze. "Impossible," Matilda murmured. "No one should be here." Sophia quickly pulled everyone behind a large hydrangea bush. The baby, sensing the tension, began to stir in Tony's arms. A silhouette appeared in the illuminated window, a woman, her long dark hair swaying in the night breeze. For a moment, Tony felt his heart stop. "Clara," he whispered, taking a step forward. But Sophia pulled him back. "That's not her," she said urgently. "It's a trap. They knew we'd come here." As if confirming her words, other lights began to turn on in the house, and shadows of men could be seen moving inside the rooms. "What do we do now?" Helen asked, her voice trembling slightly. Matilda was already moving, guiding them to the back of the garden. "There's another place," she said. "The old hunting lodge, where your mother used to hide to paint." Another wave of memories hit Tony. His mother, sitting in front of a canvas, brush in hand, smiling at him and his sisters. The smell of oil paint, the sound of the nearby creek, the feeling of peace and safety that place provided. "She wasn't sick, was she?" he asked as they moved silently away from the house. "Mom, it wasn't an illness that took her." "No," Sophia confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "She discovered something, just like Clara, and she paid the price for it." The baby began to cry softly, and Tony realized that he must be hungry. It had been hours since he found him in the trunk of the car. "Shh, little one," he murmured, rocking him gently. "It's going to be all right." "Tony," Helen called softly, "he needs care. We need to find food, diapers." "There are supplies in the lodge," Matilda assured. Clara left everything prepared. They continued to move through the overgrown garden, each step bringing more memories to the surface. Tony now remembered playing there with his sisters, climbing the trees, listening to the stories his mother told about the family history. "Why did our father do this?" he asked, more to himself than to the others. "Why separate our family like this?" "Power," Matilda replied simply. "And fear. Your father wasn't a bad man, Tony, but he made terrible choices to protect secrets that weren't his." They finally reached the lodge, a smaller and more discreet building, partially hidden by a group of old willow trees. Matilda unlocked the door with another key from her ring. Inside, by the light of their cell phones, they could see that the place had been prepared to receive them. There was an improvised crib, cans of formula, diapers, water, and other basic supplies. "Clara knew," Sophia said, looking around. "She knew we'd end up here." The baby began to cry louder now, clearly hungry. Helen, surprising everyone, picked up one of the cans of formula and began to prepare a bottle with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. "I was a nanny during college," she explained, noticing the surprised looks. "Never imagined I'd be using those skills on my husband's nephew." Tony watched as Helen fed the baby, who eagerly accepted the bottle. There was something in the scene that made his heart clench, a feeling of home, of family that he had lost so long ago. A noise outside alerted them. Matilda quickly turned off the flashlights, plunging everyone into darkness. The only sound was that of the baby sucking on the bottle. "They're searching. The garden," Sophia whispered. "They won't be long in finding us here." "Why is the baby so important to them?" Helen asked, her voice just a breath in the dark. "Because he's the proof," Matilda replied. "The proof of something that your family has been trying to hide for generations, something that would change the balance of power in the entire region." Tony looked at the small being in Helen's arms, so innocent and oblivious to the danger that surrounded him. His nephew, Clara's son, the last link to a truth that had cost his mother her life and now threatened his sister. "I need to find Clara," he said, his voice regaining its characteristic firmness. "I need to understand the whole truth." More footsteps could be heard now, approaching the lodge. The baby, having finished his bottle, let out a small burp. "First," Sophia said, "we need to survive tonight." In the darkness of the lodge, the group remained in absolute silence as the footsteps drew closer. The baby, as if sensing the danger, didn't make a sound in Helen's arms. Tony could hear his own heart beating loudly against his chest, each beat seeming to echo in the silence of the night. Matilda signaled for everyone to move to the back of the lodge, where an old tapestry partially covered the wall. With silent movements, she pulled the fabric away, revealing a small door that blended in with the wood paneling. "Your mother had this built," she whispered, so softly they could barely hear her. "She knew that one day it would be necessary." The voices of the men who were looking for them were closer now. The light from flashlights could be seen through the cracks in the lodge windows. "Are you sure they came this way?" A male voice asked. "The gardener said he saw movement near the willow trees," another voice replied, "and there are recent footprints in the wet earth." Matilda was already opening the secret door, which revealed a tight space, more of a closet than a passageway. Helen, still holding the baby, was the first to enter, followed by Sophia. Tony hesitated. "I'm not going to hide like a rat," he muttered, years of pride and power making it difficult to accept the situation. "This is no time for pride," Matilda scolded, her voice firm but gentle. "Your mother was proud too, and look what happened to her." The words hit Tony like a slap in the face. More memories began to surface. His mother, in her final days, pale and scared, but still trying to maintain a smile for her children. At the time, they all believed it was the illness. Now, he understood that it was fear. The door to the lodge creaked open. Matilda pushed Tony into the hiding place and closed the door just in time. Through small cracks in the wood, they could see the inside of the lodge being illuminated by flashlights. "Search every corner," ordered a voice that made Tony freeze. "They can't have gone far with the baby." It was the voice of Ricardo Mendoza, his main business partner, the man his father had chosen as his mentor when Tony started in the company. "Ricardo?" Helen whispered, clearly recognizing the voice too. "What does he have to do with this?" Sophia put a finger to her lips, asking for silence. The baby stirred restlessly, and everyone held their breath. Helen gently squeezed him against her chest, rocking him as discreetly as possible. "Mr. Mendoza," one of the voices called, "we found this." Through the cracks, Tony saw one of the men hand something to Ricardo. It appeared to be an old photograph. "Where was it?" Ricardo asked, his voice taking on a tenser tone. "Lying near the makeshift crib. Looks like they've been here recently." Ricardo held the photo close to the flashlight to examine it better. Tony felt his heart stop as he recognized the image. It was a photo of him with his sisters sitting on their mother's lap in that very lodge. A photo that he didn't remember seeing before. Yet another memory that had been erased. "Clara was always too sentimental," Ricardo murmured, crumpling the photo. "Just like her mother, never knew when to let the past go." The way he spoke about his mother made Tony's blood boil. He wanted to come out of the hiding place and confront him, demand answers, but he felt Sophia's hand hold his arm tightly. "Keep looking," Ricardo ordered. "They have to be somewhere nearby. The baby can't have vanished." The men continued to ransack the lodge. One of them approached the tapestry dangerously close, but something outside caught his attention. "Sir, we found something in the garden." Ricardo and his men quickly left the lodge. As soon as the footsteps faded away, Matilda opened the door to the hiding place, allowing everyone to breathe a sigh of relief. "How is Ricardo involved in this?" Tony asked, his voice trembling with contained rage. "He's always been involved," Matilda replied, checking through the window to see if it was safe to leave. He was the one who helped your father organize everything after she was gone. But why? What could be so important as to destroy an entire family? Sophia pulled something out of her pocket, a small envelope yellowed with time. Clara managed to uncover part of the truth before she disappeared. "It's all here." With trembling hands, Tony opened the envelope. Inside were old documents, some so fragile that they threatened to fall apart at the touch. They were land deeds, contracts, and a detailed family tree. "I don't understand," he said, trying to make sense of the information in the dim light. "What does this mean?" "It means that everything you've built," Sophia explained, "the entire empire that you believe you created from scratch, was actually yours by right. The lands, the companies, everything belonged to our family for generations. But Dad always said we started from nothing," Tony protested, "that he built everything with hard work." "He lied," Matilda interrupted gently. "Your father was just a caretaker. The real power, the real inheritance, always belonged to your mother's line. That's why they silenced her when she discovered the truth." The baby began to cry softly, and Helen tried to soothe him. "And Clara?" she asked. "How did she find all this out?" "Clara was always the most perceptive," Sophia replied with a sad smile. "Even when we were children, she noticed things that no one else did. After she managed to escape the programming that Dad imposed, she began to investigate. She found documents, people who knew the truth. And now she's disappeared," Tony finished, the realization of the danger his sister was in weighing on his chest. A noise from the garden alerted them again. The lights from the flashlights were coming back towards the lodge. "They haven't given up," Matilda murmured. "We need to get out of here." "Where to?" Helen asked, adjusting the baby who was starting to get restless again. Sophia approached one of the walls of the lodge and pressed a specific spot. A small panel opened, revealing a ladder that descended into the darkness. "To the only place where we'll be safe," she replied. "To the place where it all began." Tony looked at the baby in Helen's arms, his nephew, the last link to a sister, who was in danger, the heir to a legacy that he didn't even know existed. So many secrets, so many lies, so many lives destroyed. "We're going to find Clara," he said, his voice carrying a promise. "And we're going to make Ricardo pay for all of this." The lights from the flashlights were already illuminating the windows of the lodge again. There was no more time for hesitation. One by one, they began to descend the secret ladder, plunging into the darkness that held even more secrets of their family. The baby, nestled in Helen's arms, let out a small sigh, as if he knew that his presence had unleashed a sequence of events that would forever change the destiny of everyone there. In the darkness of the ladder, Tony felt silent tears streaming down his face, tears for a lost childhood, for a shattered family, and for a sister he might never see again. The ladder spiraled downwards, each step creaking softly beneath their feet. The air grew colder and damper as they descended, and the smell of wet earth intensified. Helen held the baby firmly against her chest, while Sophia illuminated the way with the flashlight on her cell phone. Matilda came last, carefully closing the secret entrance behind them. Tony could feel his heart pounding, not only from the fear of being pursued, but because each step seemed to awaken more memories. The smell of the place was strangely familiar, as if it were part of long-forgotten dreams. "I've been here before," he murmured, running his hand along the stone wall. "As a child?" "Yes," Sophia confirmed softly. "It was Clara's favorite place to play hide-and-seek. You always complained that she knew all the best hiding spots." The baby let out a small whimper, and Helen stopped to adjust him better in her arms. "He's cold," she said, worried. "How long are we going to be down here?" "Not much longer," Matilda responded. "Where we're going is more welcoming." They continued down for a few more minutes until they reached a landing. Sophia directed the light towards an old wooden door, its hinges darkened by time. "What is this place?" Tony asked, observing the elaborate carvings in the wood, symbols that seemed to tell a story. "The heart of the estate," Matilda replied, pulling out another key from her ring. "The place where your mother kept all the family's secrets." The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a room that made everyone stop, surprised. It wasn't the damp dungeon they were expecting, but a spacious and surprisingly well-preserved room. Bookshelves covered the walls, and several antique wooden tables were arranged throughout the room, covered with documents, maps, and various objects. "The secret library," Sophia explained, as Matilda lit some old lamps, illuminating the room with a soft and welcoming light. "Mum used to spend hours here, studying the family history, trying to understand what had been taken from her." Helen found an old couch in a corner and sat down with the baby, who finally seemed to relax. Tony approached one of the tables, where a large map of the region was spread out. Markings in red highlighted several properties. "Those are all the lands that belonged to our family," Sophia explained, stopping beside her brother. "Before Dad started selling them to Ricardo and his associates." "But why?" Tony asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Why sell such a valuable inheritance?" "Because he had no choice," Matilda replied, approaching with a thick book in her hands. "Your father was being blackmailed. Ricardo and his friends discovered something about him, something that forced him to do everything they wanted." "What did they discover?" Matilda opened the book. It was an album of old photographs. On the first page, there was a photo that made Tony feel as if he had been punched in the stomach. It was his father, much younger, next to a woman who wasn't his mother. In her arms, there was a baby. "Your father had another family," Sophia said softly. "A child that no one knew existed. Ricardo found out and used that to force him to do what they wanted." "Another brother?" Tony murmured, feeling his head spin with yet another revelation. "Half-brother," Matilda corrected. "And you know him very well. In fact, you've been doing business with him for the past few years." A name surfaced in Tony's mind, making his blood run cold. "Edward," he whispered. "Edward Mendonca." Edward was his main competitor in business, the owner of a rival company that always seemed to know exactly how to undermine Tony's interests. The two had harbored a mutual antipathy since their first meeting, a hostility that neither of them fully understood. Until now. "Yes," Sophia confirmed, "Edward is your half-brother, and he doesn't know it. Ricardo kept that information a secret, using it to manipulate both Dad and Edward, pitting the two brothers against each other without them knowing." Helen, who had listened to everything in silence, suddenly let out an exclamation. "The baby!" she said, looking at the child in her arms with new eyes. "He has Edward's eyes." Everyone turned to look at the little one, who was now sleeping peacefully. It was true. The resemblance was undeniable. Clara discovered the truth. "About Edward," Matilda continued, "and more than that, she discovered that Ricardo was behind a much larger scheme. He wasn't just stealing the family lands. He was using the old documents to forge deeds, claiming properties that were never his." "And now Clara has disappeared," Tony finished, the anger growing in his voice, "because she found all of this out." A noise coming from the ladder made them freeze. Heavy footsteps descended the steps, accompanied by muffled voices. "They followed us," Helen whispered, clutching the baby closer to her. Matilda quickly began to extinguish the lamps, while Sophia ran to collect the most important documents. Tony looked around, desperate for an exit. "This way," Matilda indicated, moving one of the bookshelves with a surprising strength for her age. Behind it, there was another passageway. "This tunnel leads to the old chapel. It's our only chance." But before they could move, a familiar voice echoed from the ladder, making everyone freeze. "Tony!" The voice called, weak and trembling. "Tony, are you there?" It was Clara. The baby woke up at that moment as if recognizing his mother's voice and began to cry softly. Helen tried to soothe him, but it was too late. The sound had given away their location. Rapid footsteps descended the rest of the ladder. The door to the library burst open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Clara, pale, bruised but alive. Behind her, holding a gun to her back, was Ricardo Mendoza. "What a touching family reunion," he said, his cold smile illuminated by the only lamp that was still lit. "Now, how about we talk about those documents that Clara stole from me?" The baby cried louder, reaching his little arms out towards his mother. Clara sobbed, trying to take a step forward, but Ricardo held her firmly. "Nobody moves," he ordered, "or our dear Clara here will join your mother sooner than planned." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead, broken only by the soft cries of the baby and Clara's ragged breathing. Tony watched his sister, rediscovered after so many years, and his heart ached to see the bruises on her face, the fear in her eyes, so similar to his own. "Let her go, Ricardo," Tony said, his voice controlled, despite the anger that was seething inside. "You've caused enough destruction in my family." Ricardo laughed, a humorless sound that echoed through the old walls of the library. "Your family? You didn't even know you had a family until a few hours ago, Tony. I, on the other hand, have spent decades looking after the Mendez interests." "Looking after the interests?" Sophia interjected, her voice trembling with indignation. "You destroyed our family. You manipulated our father. You hid the truth about Edward. You killed our mother." "Your mother committed suicide," Ricardo replied coldly. "At least that's what the official records say." Clara let out a choked sob, and the baby cried louder, as if sensing his mother's anguish. Helen cradled him gently, trying to soothe him, her eyes fixed on Clara with a mixture of compassion and fear. "What do you want, Ricardo?" Tony asked, taking a small step forward. "The documents, the money, the lands, you can have it all." "Ah, Tony," Ricardo sighed, like a teacher disappointed with a student. "Always thinking that everything comes down to money. No, what I want is much more valuable. I want what your family stole from me 3 generations. Matilda, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "You're a Mendoza," she said, her voice carrying the weight of old memories. "The last of the Mendozas." Ricardo narrowed, his eyes at the old housekeeper. "So you always knew, didn't you, Matilda, about how the Mendez stole the lands that belonged to my family using forged documents and bribes?" "That's not true," Matilda replied firmly. "It was the Mendozas who tried to take the lands by force. Your own grandmother confessed everything on her deathbed." "Lies!" Ricardo shouted, his composure finally breaking. He tightened his arm around Clara's neck, making her groan in pain. "My family built all of this. The Mendez were nothing, less than nothing. Thieves and liars who—" "Like Edward," Clara managed to say, even with the pressure on her throat. "You're using him just like you used our father." Ricardo was very quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained that controlled, cold tone. "Edward is just a piece on the board, just like your father was, just like all of you are." "Where is Edward now?" Tony asked, trying to keep Ricardo talking while his mind worked on a plan. "Does he know he's my brother? That this baby is his nephew?" "Edward is where he needs to be," Ricardo replied vaguely. "And no, he doesn't know about the blood tie he shares with you. It would be inconvenient for my plans if he found out." The baby had calmed down a little in Helen's arms, who very slowly began to move towards the bookshelf that Matilda had moved earlier, revealing the secret passage. Tony saw the movement out of the corner of his eye and continued talking, trying to keep Ricardo's attention. "What plans are those, Ricardo? What do you really want?" "Justice," he replied, his eyes gleaming with an almost maniacal intensity. Retribution, to see the Mendez empire crumble stone by stone, just as the Mendoza's empire crumbled 3 generations ago. And for that, you needed to separate our family, Sophia asked, tears of anger streaming down her face. Make our father erase Clara from our memories? Kill our mother? Your mother was dangerous, Ricardo spat the words. She was putting the pieces together, discovering the truth, just like Clara here. Clara took advantage of this moment to speak, her voice weak but determined. I found the original will, Ricardo. The real one. The one that proves that the lands never belonged to the Mendozas. Ricardo's face lost all color. His hand trembled slightly, but he recovered quickly. Where is it? In a safe place, Clara replied. With someone you'll never find. With Edward, Ricardo concluded, a cruel smile forming on his lips. You reached out to him, didn't you? Told him about your father, about you being siblings. Clara didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. That's why you disappeared? Tony asked, the pieces finally falling into place. To find Edward? I needed to tell him, Clara replied, tears streaming down her face. He deserved to know the truth. And when I found out I was pregnant, that my son would be the nephew of the man Ricardo had turned into our greatest enemy, always the sentimental one in the family, Ricardo mocked. Just like your mother, and you'll end up just like her too. It was at that moment that several things happened at the same time. The baby, who had been quiet in Helen's arms, let out a piercing, deafening cry. Taking advantage of the distraction, Clara jabbed her elbow into Ricardo's ribs with all the strength she could muster. Matilda, moving with surprising agility for her age, threw the heavy photograph album that she was still holding straight at Ricardo's face. The impact caused him to stumble backwards, losing his balance on the stairs. Clara managed to break free and ran towards Helen and her baby, who was now crying at the top of his lungs. Get out of here, Matilda shouted, pushing Helen and Clara towards the secret passage behind the bookshelf. Quick! But Ricardo was already recovering, his face contorted into a mask of fury. Nobody's going anywhere, he snarled, getting up with difficulty. It was then that a new sound echoed through the subterranean library, footsteps descending the stairs. Many footsteps. Ricardo? A voice called, making everyone freeze. Ricardo? Are you down there? It was Edward's voice. Ricardo's face changed. Completely, all the blood draining from his face. For the first time, there was true fear in his eyes. You brought him here? He hissed to Clara. You fool! Do you have any idea what you've just done? The footsteps were closer now. Clara held, her son in her arms, finally reunited with her baby after what seemed like eternal days. Tony positioned himself in front of his sisters, facing Ricardo with a steely determination. It's over, Ricardo, he said. The truth always finds a way. Edward appeared at the top of the stairs, his silhouette outlined against the dim light. His eyes, so similar to Tony's, scanned the scene before him, lingering on each face, until finally landing on the baby in Clara's arms. So it's true, he said softly. Everything you told me, Clara, about us being brothers, about Ricardo. Ricardo took a step towards the stairs, but Edward drew a gun, pointing it directly at his former mentor. Don't move, he ordered. I've heard enough confession to understand exactly what kind of man you are. The sound of more footsteps filled the staircase. The police, called by Edward, had finally arrived. Ricardo looked around, like a cornered animal, his eyes landing on the baby in Clara's arms. That child, he said, his voice trembling with contained rage, is the only living proof of what you did to my family, the last descendant of the thieves who destroyed the Mendozas. Then, before anyone could react, he lunged towards Clara and the baby. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. Tony threw himself in front of Clara and the baby at the exact moment that Ricardo reached them. The two men fell to the floor of the library, knocking over one of the antique tables in the process. Centuries-old documents flew through the air. As they fought, "Stop!" Edward shouted, his gun still pointed but unable to aim with the two men struggling. Clara backed away with the baby, protected by Sophia and Helen, while Matilda ran to prevent more important documents from being destroyed in the confusion. Ricardo, despite his age, had the strength of desperation. His hands found Tony's neck, squeezing with a murderous fury. "You destroyed everything," he shouted, completely beside himself. "3 generations of lies." Tony struggled to breathe, but even so managed to say, "You're wrong about everything." It was at that moment that Matilda, holding a yellowed envelope, cried out, "Ricardo, look at this." Something in her voice made everyone stop. Ricardo slightly loosened his grip on Tony's neck, his eyes fixed on the envelope in the housekeeper's hands. "What is that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "The true history of the Mendozas," Matilda replied, opening the envelope carefully. "Your grandmother's confession, written on her deathbed, the one you never wanted to read." "Lies!" Ricardo shouted, but there was a tremor of uncertainty in his voice. "Your grandmother wrote this for you," Matilda continued, her voice gentle but firm. "She tried to tell you the truth before she died, but you were too blinded by hatred to listen." Edward descended the rest of the stairs slowly, his gun still pointed at Ricardo, but his eyes fixed on the envelope. The police officers accompanying him remained at the top of the stairs, watching the scene with weapons drawn. Matilda began to read. "My dear grandson Ricardo, by the time you read this letter, I will be gone. I carry a terrible weight on my conscience, a secret that has destroyed not only our family, but also the Mendes. The truth you believe you know about our past is a lie that I helped create. It wasn't the Mendes who stole our lands. It was your grandfather, my husband, who forged documents and bribed officials to take what didn't belong to us. The Mendes were our partners, our friends. They trusted us, and we betrayed them." Ricardo had completely released Tony now, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "No, it can't be." Matilda continued reading. "Your grandfather's greed knew no bounds. When the Mendes discovered the fraud, he did something terrible, something that haunts me to this day. The death of the Mendes patriarch was not an accident. It was murder." A deathly silence fell over the subterranean library. The baby in Clara's arms let out a small whimper, as if sensing the weight of that revelation. "But then," Edward began, lowering his gun slowly, why did he hide all of this from us?" "Because he found out the truth," Clara replied softly. "That's why he reached out to the Mendozas, trying to make amends, trying to fix what had been broken. And that's when he met your mother, Edward." "And Ricardo used that to blackmail him," Tony completed, massaging his bruised neck. "Threatened to expose the affair, destroy his reputation. Not only that," Matilda interrupted, still holding the letter. "There's more." She continued reading. "Ricardo, my grandson, you grew up hearing stories about how the Mendes were our enemies, how they had stolen our legacy. I fueled that hatred, that thirst for revenge, because the guilt over what we did was unbearable. It was easier to turn them into villains than to admit our own villainy. But there's something you need to know, something that will make all of this even more painful. Your mother, my dear daughter, she discovered the truth shortly before she died. And it wasn't a car accident that killed her, as you always believed. She couldn't bear the weight of the guilt, the horror of discovering what her family had done." Ricardo fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face for the first time. "Mom, she took her own life. Matilda completed softly. Just like Tony's mother years later, when she discovered that history was about to repeat itself. The police finally descended the stairs, handcuffing Ricardo, who offered no resistance. He looked like a broken man, all his hatred and determination transformed into a deep and irremediable pain. Tony approached Edward, who was watching everything with a stunned expression. For the first time, the two brothers really looked at each other, seeing beyond the hatred cultivated by years of manipulation. "I'm sorry," Tony said simply. Edward nodded, unshed tears glistening in his eyes. "Me too." Clara approached the brothers, the baby now sleeping peacefully in her arms. "He has the Mendez eyes," she said softly, "the same eyes that you both have." Helen and Sophia joined them, forming a protective circle around the baby, the new generation, free from the weight of the secrets and lies that had destroyed so many lives. Matilda watched the scene with a sad smile, still holding the letter that had changed everything. As Ricardo was led away by the police, she couldn't help but think of all the lives that had been affected by that story of greed and revenge. But when the baby opened his eyes and smiled, she saw something different in that smile. She saw hope. Hope that the cycle of hatred and lies had finally been broken. What none of them knew, however, was that that night still held one more revelation. The one that would forever change the destiny of the Mendez and Mendoza families. As the police led Ricardo out of the subterranean library, Matilda approached an old desk in the darkest corner of the room. With trembling hands, she opened a secret drawer and removed another envelope, this one even older and more yellowed than the previous one. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said, her voice filled with an emotion that no one there had ever witnessed before. "Something that your mother discovered shortly before she died. Something that changed everything." The baby, as if sensing the importance of the moment, opened his little eyes and was silent in Clara's arms. Tony, Edward, Sophia and Helen approached, forming a semicircle around the old housekeeper. "What could be worse than everything we've already discovered?" Edward asked, his voice still trembling with the previous revelations. Matilda opened the envelope with reverent care. Inside, there was an old photograph and a letter written in an elegant and firm handwriting. The photo showed two young women embracing and smiling at the camera. "This," Matilda pointed to one of the women, "is Ricardo's grandmother, Marina Mendoza. And this," her finger moved to the other woman, "is your grandmother, Beatriz Mendez. They look happy," Sophia commented, observing the evident intimacy in the photo. "They were more than friends," Matilda continued. "They were sisters." The shock of the revelation caused everyone to hold their breath. Helen, who was holding Tony's hand, felt him tremble. "Sisters?" he repeated, incredulous. "But how?" "The story that you know, that Ricardo knew, was just the surface," Matilda explained, unfolding the letter carefully. "The real tragedy began a generation earlier, with a secret that destroyed not only two families, but two sisters who loved each other deeply." Clara adjusted the baby in her arms and sat down in an old armchair. "Please, Matilda, tell us everything." The housekeeper nodded and began to read the letter. "Dear Marina, if you are reading this letter, it means that I have not had courage to tell you personally the truth I discovered. How could we have imagined that our mother's secret, kept for so many years, would come back to haunt us in this way? When I discovered that we were sisters, that our mother had been forced to separate us at birth to protect the family's inheritance, I thought we could overcome everything, that the love we had always felt for each other, even without knowing our true kinship, would be stronger than social conventions, than the prejudices of the time. But her husband discovered the truth, and the way he used this information. Marina, forgive me, But I can no longer bear the weight of this secret. The lands he so desires, which have driven him mad with greed, were already yours by right. You are the firstborn, even if no one knows it. The Mendes inheritance should have been yours. Now he threatens to expose everything, destroying not only our lives, but also the future of our children, and I cannot allow that. Forgive me, my dear sister. Forgive me for not being strong enough to fight by your side. May our grandchildren one day discover the truth and reunite what our generation destroyed. With all my love, Beatrice. The silence that followed the reading was as heavy as lead. The baby let out a small sigh, breaking the tension momentarily. So, Ricardo is our cousin? Sophia asked, her voice almost a whisper. Yes, Matilda confirmed, and all his quest for revenge, all his hatred for the Mendes was directed at his own family, the same family he swore to destroy. Edward leaned against a nearby bookshelf, seeming suddenly very tired. And our father? Did he know about this? No, Matilda replied. Your mother discovered the truth in the old family documents, just as Clara did. But unlike Clara, she didn't have time to share the discovery with anyone but me. Tony walked to the photo on the wall that showed his mother. Now he could see the resemblance to the woman in the old photograph, his grandmother Beatrice. The same determined eyes, the same gentle smile. Why didn't you ever tell us, Matilda? He asked, his voice choked with emotion. The housekeeper sighed deeply. Your mother made me promise that I would only reveal the truth when it was absolutely necessary. She feared that knowledge could be dangerous for you, just as it was for her. Clara stood up, approaching Tony with the baby. And now? What do we do with all this truth? Now, Helen interjected, for the first time since the beginning of the revelation, you have the chance to do what your grandmothers couldn't. You can reunite the family, heal old wounds. Edward approached the group, his eyes fixed on the nephew in Clara's arms. He is the living proof of that union, he said softly. The first Mendes Mendoza, born without the weight of hatred and secrets. The baby chose that moment to smile, a luminous smile that seemed to illuminate the entire subterranean library. It was as if he understood that his birth represented a new beginning, a chance for redemption for two families so long divided. Matilda watched the scene with tears in her eyes. After decades of keeping secrets, she could finally see the truth, freeing those she had sworn to protect. But while everyone admired the baby and processed the revelations, no one noticed a small detail in the old photo. A locket that Marina Mendoza wore, identical to the one Ricardo always carried around his neck. A locket that, at that very moment, was being discovered by the police officers who arrested him, revealing inside one last secret that would change everything once again. The sun was beginning to rise when one of the police officers who had taken Ricardo entered the subterranean library in a hurry. In his hands, he held the locket that they had found on the prisoner. Gentlemen, he said, addressing Tony and Edward, we found something you need to see. The police officer handed the locket to Matilda, who examined it with wide eyes. It's impossible, she murmured. After all these years. What is it, Matilda? Sophia asked, approaching the housekeeper. With trembling fingers, Matilda opened the locket. Inside, there was an antique key and a small piece of folded paper. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the words written on it were still perfectly legible. It's Marina Mendoza's handwriting, Matilda said, her voice filled with emotion, a message for Ricardo that he apparently never read. Clara, still holding the baby, sat down again in the old armchair. What does the message say? Matilda began to read. My dear grandson Ricardo, this locket contains not only a message, but also the key to all the truth. The key that opens the chest hidden in the place where your mother and I used to play as children before we discovered that we were sisters, before all the hatred and bitterness. I have spent my entire life carrying the weight of a secret that has destroyed not only my family, but also that of my dear sister Beatrice. When your grandfather discovered the truth about our kinship, he did not see a blessing in it, a chance to unite our families. Instead, he saw an opportunity for revenge against those who, according to him, had separated us. But the real story is very different from the one he knew. The truth about why we were separated at birth, about the real reason why the Mendez fortune was divided in the way it was. Everything is documented and kept in that chest. The key that accompanies this message opens not only the chest, but also the doors to the redemption of our families. Use it wisely, my dear grandson. Do not allow the hatred that consumed your grandfather, that destroyed your mother, to continue poisoning the next generations. With love, your grandmother Marina. Helen, who was next to Tony, squeezed his hand. Do you know where this place is? Where they played as children? Matilda nodded slowly. The hunting lodge, the same place where we hid earlier tonight. So, the chest has been there all along? Edward asked, incredulous. Behind the old tapestry, Matilda confirmed. There's a secret compartment that we never managed to open. We always thought the key had been lost with Marina when she died. The baby began to stir in Clara's arms, as if sensing the electricity in the air. Tony approached his sister and nephew, observing how the child calmed down immediately at his touch. We need to go there, he said, his voice firm. We need to know the whole truth. Wouldn't it be better to wait until it's completely dawn? Helen suggested, worried. After everything that's happened. No, Clara interrupted softly. We've waited long enough. Our family has lived decades of lies and secrets. It's time to bring everything to light. The group organized quickly. Edward went ahead with 2 police officers, ensuring the path was safe. The rest followed closely behind, with Matilda guiding the way through the tunnels she knew so well. When they arrived at the hunting lodge, the sun had already risen completely, its golden rays streaming through the dusty windows. The place looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more melancholic, as if the walls themselves held the memories of happier times. Matilda went straight to the old tapestry, her experienced hands quickly finding the secret panel. In the wall, the key from the locket fit perfectly into the lock. When the panel opened, everyone held their breath. Inside, there was a carved wooden chest, small but beautifully crafted. On the lid, the symbols of the Mendez and Mendoza families were intertwined in a single emblem. They were always one family, Sophia murmured, touching the symbols with reverence. Matilda used the same key to open the chest. Inside, carefully preserved, were documents, letters, and old photographs. But what caught everyone's attention was a sealed envelope on top of the pile, addressed to my great-grandchildren. With trembling hands, Tony took the envelope. The paper was thin, almost translucent with age, but the wax seal was still intact. He looked at Edward, who nodded slightly. Breaking the seal, Tony began to read aloud. My dear great-grandchildren, if you are reading this letter, it means that finally the truth has found its way through the generations of lies and secrets that have divided our family. The story you know about the separation of the Mendez-Mendoza sisters is only part of the truth. The real reason why we were separated at birth, why the fortune was divided in the way it was, is related to a promise made more than a century ago, a promise that now, finally, can be fulfilled. The baby let out a small sigh in his sleep, as if even in his dreams he could feel the weight of that moment. Clara rocked him gently, silent tears streaming down her face as she listened to the words of her great-grandmother. The truth that was about to be revealed would change not only the understanding of the past, but also the future of everyone present. It was a truth that had cost lives, destroyed families, but that now, finally, could bring the peace that all those generations had sought. Tony continued reading the letter, his voice trembling slightly with each revelation. The promise that divided our family was made in a moment of despair, during the great drought that plagued our region more than 100 years ago. At that time, the lands belonged to a single owner, our great-grandfather Augusto Mendez. He had two twin daughters, Beatrice and Marina, but only one could inherit the lands according to the laws of the time. The drought had destroyed almost everything, and many families in the region were starving. It was then that Augusto made a pact with God. If the rain returned and the lands returned to produce, he would divide his fortune and separate his twin daughters at birth. One would be raised as a Mendez, the other as a Mendoza, and when the truth finally came to light, the lands should be reunited under the joint administration of the two families. The rain returned that same night, saving not only our lands, but the entire region. Augusto fulfilled his promise. I was given to the Mendoza family, while Beatrice remained with the Mendez. We grew up separately, without knowing we were sisters, until fate brought us together in our teens. When we discovered the truth about our kinship, we vowed that one day we would reunite the families. But Marina's husband, consumed by greed, used the information for his own purposes, starting a chain of events that has brought us here. The true inheritance of the Mendez and Mendoza families is not the lands or the fortunes. It is the promise of unity, of healing, of redemption. And that promise can only be fulfilled when a descendant of each family voluntarily unites for love and not for obligation, bringing peace to future generations. Clara let out a small sigh of surprise, clutching the baby closer to her chest. All eyes turned to her. "The baby," Helen whispered, understanding. "He's Clara Mendez's son with my son," a voice completed from the door of the lodge. Everyone turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was Ricardo, handcuffed and escorted by two police officers. His face was marked by tears. "How?" Edward began to ask. "He begged to come here," one of the police officers explained. "Said he needed to tell you something important before he was taken away." Ricardo took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the baby in Clara's arms. "Thomas," he said softly. "My son, the baby's father." Clara nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I met him a year ago at an art exhibition. We didn't know. None of us knew about the connection between our families. He died 6 months ago," Ricardo continued, his voice broken. "A car accident. When I found out that Clara was pregnant, that my grandson would be the link between the families, I went crazy. I couldn't accept that the promise would be fulfilled in this way, not after everything I had done to keep the families apart. The baby chose that moment to wake up, his little eyes opening to face his grandfather." Ricardo sobbed as he saw his son's face reflected in his grandson's features. "He has Thomas's eyes," he murmured. "The same eyes that Marina had, that we all have." Matilda approached Ricardo, holding out the locket. "Why didn't you ever open this? Why didn't you ever read your grandmother's message?" Ricardo lowered his head, ashamed. "Because I was afraid. Afraid to discover that everything I believed was a lie. Afraid that my hatred, my quest for revenge, had no foundation." "And now?" Tony asked, his voice gentler than he had intended. "What do we do with all this truth?" Ricardo looked at each face present. His cousins he had sworn to destroy, the woman his son had loved, the grandson who represented everything his grandmother had dreamed of. "Now," he said, "you do what I didn't have the courage to do. Fulfill the promise, reunite the families." Clara stood up slowly and, to everyone's surprise, approached Ricardo with the baby. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked softly. "Your grandson?" Ricardo's handcuffed hands trembled when Clara placed the little one in his arms. The baby, instead of crying, smiled at his grandfather, a smile so pure and innocent that it made everyone's heart clench. "Miguel," Clara said. "That's his name. Miguel Mendez Mendoza." Ricardo sobbed, kissing his grandson's forehead. "The name of my father, of Thomas's father." The morning sun streamed through the windows of the lodge, illuminating the scene with an almost magical golden light. Helen held Tony's hand, while Sophia and Edward approached Clara and Ricardo, forming a circle around the baby. Matilda watched everything with tears in her eyes, thinking of Marina and Beatrice, of the promises made and broken, and now, finally, fulfilled through the innocent love of two people who didn't know they were destined to heal such ancient wounds. But while everyone watched little Miguel in his grandfather's arms, no one noticed that among the documents in the chest there was one more letter, still unopened. A letter that would reveal one last truth, a truth that would change not only the destiny of the Mendez and Mendoza families, but also the future of the entire region. It was Sophia who found the last letter, while organizing the documents that had fallen from the chest. The envelope was at the bottom, sealed with the same coat of arms that united the symbols of the Mendez and Mendoza families. Her hands trembled as she held the aged paper. "There's one more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ricardo, who was still holding Miguel in his arms, looked at the envelope with an expression of recognition. "That handwriting, it's my mother's." Clara gently took the baby back, allowing Matilda to approach and examine the letter. The old housekeeper adjusted her glasses and confirmed, "Yes, it's Isabel Mendoza's handwriting. The last letter she wrote before taking her own life," Ricardo completed, his voice choked with emotion. Tony took the envelope carefully, looking at Edward for approval. When his brother nodded, he broke the seal and began to read, "My dear son Ricardo, when you find this letter, I will no longer be here. The weight of the truth I have discovered is too great to carry, but I cannot leave without trying to fix what our family has destroyed. The story you know about the Mendez and the Mendoza is only the surface of something much bigger, something that involves not only our families, but all this land that has seen so much blood and tears. During my research on our history, I discovered that the promise made by Augusto Mendez was not just an agreement with God, it was a pact with the land itself. The waters that saved our region at that time came from an underground aquifer, a hidden treasure whose existence few know. The documents I found prove that both the Mendez and the Mendoza were guardians of this secret. The separation of the families was not only because of the inheritance, it was to protect the knowledge about the underground waters, ensuring that neither side had total power over something so precious. Your father found out about the aquifer and planned to use it for his own benefit, without caring about the consequences for the region. That's why I started investigating, that I discovered the whole truth about our history. Ricardo, my son, you need to understand, the true wealth of these lands is not in the property titles or the accumulated fortunes. It is in the water that flows silently beneath our feet, feeding not only our lands, but the entire region. Augusto Mendez's promise had a greater purpose, to ensure that this natural treasure was protected by two families, two different perspectives, creating a balance that neither side could break alone. Along with this letter, I leave maps and documents that show the location and extent of the aquifer. Use this information wisely, my son. Do not allow the greed that consumed your father, that destroyed so many lives, to continue guiding our actions. The baby who will unite our families, yes, I know about him, even though I'm no longer here to meet him, will be the first of a new generation. A generation that will not carry the weight of our mistakes, but the responsibility of protecting something much greater than our differences. With eternal love, your mother Isabel. A profound silence fell over the lodge as Tony finished reading. Miguel, in Clara's arms, let out a small sigh, as if he understood the importance of that moment. "The maps," Matilda said finally, rummaging through the chest. "They must be here somewhere." Helen, who had remained silent until then, approached to help with the search. At the bottom of the chest, they found an old leather tube. Inside, carefully rolled up, were detailed maps of the region, with markings showing the course of the underground aquifer. "It's immense," Edward murmured, examining the maps with wide eyes. "It runs beneath all our lands and far beyond. That's why the region has never suffered from droughts like the rest of the state," Sophia commented, remembering the stories she had heard about the prosperity of the Mendez and Mendoza lands. Ricardo, still handcuffed, took a step forward to look at the maps. His hands trembled as he pointed to a specific area. "Here. It was where my father planned to build an industrial complex. He must have found out about the aquifer and you continued with his plans," Tony completed, without accusation in his voice, without knowing the real reason. "Construction was scheduled to begin next month," Ricardo admitted, the shame evident in his face. "I had already obtained all the permits, bribed the environmental inspectors. We can still stop it," Clara said firmly, cradling Miguel. "We can still do the right thing." Edward nodded, approaching Ricardo. "It's not too late to fix the mistakes of the past." The key. Baby began to cry softly, and all eyes turned to him. In his small features they could see the future that Isabel had imagined, a future where the Mendez and Mendoza families would work together, not for power or revenge, but for the shared responsibility of protecting something greater than themselves. "What do we do now?" Helen asked, her hand finding Tony's. Matilda, who had remained silent, observing everything with her wise eyes, finally spoke. "Now we do what should have been done generations ago. We honor the original promise, not only by reuniting the families, but by protecting the true treasure that has been entrusted to us." But while everyone agreed and began to plan the next steps, no one realized that the maps contained one more crucial piece of information. Information that could change not only the destiny of the Mendez and Mendoza families, but the future of the entire region. One last truth that still needed to come to light. It was Helen who first noticed the small, almost faded symbols on the edges of the oldest map. While everyone was discussing the next steps, she approached the window of the lodge, trying to capture the sunlight better to examine the markings. "There's something here," she said, drawing the others' attention. "They look like coordinates." Matilda approached quickly, adjusting her glasses. Her eyes widened as she recognized the symbols. "They're not coordinates," she murmured. "They're much older than that. They're markings that Augusto Mendez used in his diaries." "Can you decipher them?" Tony asked, approaching with Clara, who was still holding Miguel. The old housekeeper nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the faded symbols. "He's indicating something, a specific place where the aquifer—" She stopped abruptly, her breath catching. "What is it?" Edward asked, worried about the housekeeper's reaction. "The aquifer has a source," Matilda explained, her voice trembling slightly. "A natural spring that feeds the entire underground system, and according to these markings, it's located exactly under the family chapel," Ricardo completed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The chapel where my mother is buried." A heavy silence fell over the group as the importance of this revelation was absorbed. The Mendoza family chapel, built more than a century ago, was a sacred place not only for the family, but for the entire region. "That's why she chose to be buried there," Sophia said softly. "Your mother knew, Ricardo. She knew about the spring." Ricardo nodded, silent tears streaming down his face. And I had approved the demolition of the chapel for the construction of the industrial complex. The site would be the center of the entire project. My God, Clara whispered, clutching Miguel to her chest. The baby, sensing the tension in the air, began to whimper softly. Tony approached Ricardo, placing a hand on his shoulder. We can still stop this. There's still time. The contracts have already been signed, Ricardo replied, defeated. The demolition is scheduled to begin in 3 days. Then we have 3 days to act, Edward said firmly, to do the right thing. Helen, who was still examining the map, let out a surprised exclamation. There's something else here, another marking, almost completely erased. Matilda turned her attention to where Helen was pointing. Her eyes widened as she deciphered the symbols. It's a warning, she said, her voice grave. Augusto Mendez wrote that the spring is not only the source of the aquifer, it's a point of natural balance. If it's disturbed... What happens? Sophia asked, although something in her tone suggested that she already knew the answer. The entire underground system could collapse, Matilda completed. The consequences would be catastrophic, not only for our lands, but for the entire region. Miguel began to cry harder, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Clara cradled him gently, trying to soothe him while exchanging worried glances with the others. The construction documents, Helen said suddenly, turning to Ricardo. Where are they? In my office, at company headquarters, he replied, along with all the other documents that prove everything I did. We need those documents, Tony declared. They're the only way to prove the truth and stop the demolition legally. Edward nodded. I can get a court injunction, but we need concrete evidence. I'll go get them, Helen offered, surprising everyone. No one will suspect me. I'm just Tony's wife. Everyone knows me at the company. It's dangerous, Tony protested, holding his wife's hand. The people involved in this, they won't let those documents be exposed easily. Helen smiled softly, squeezing her husband's hand. That's exactly why I need to be the one. No one will expect the quiet Helen Mendez to be capable of something like this. Clara approached Helen, still cradling Miguel. I'll go with you, she declared. I know the company, I know the people, I can help. No, Ricardo interjected, his voice firm despite the handcuffs. It's too risky for you, Clara. Think of Miguel. Precisely because of him that I need to do this, Clara replied, looking at her son, so that he grows up in a world where we did the right thing, where we fix the mistakes of the past instead of perpetuating them. Oh. Matilda watched the scene with a mixture of pride and concern. If you're going to do this, you need to go now, she said, before anyone realizes what we've discovered here. The police officers escorting Ricardo exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, the older one, took a step forward. We didn't see or hear anything, he said, surprising everyone. But we need to take Mr. Mendoza now. Ricardo nodded, understanding. Before being taken away, he approached Clara and Miguel. Forgive me, he whispered, kissing his grandson's forehead. For everything. After Ricardo was taken away, the group began to organize quickly. Helen and Clara prepared to go to the company, while Edward left to get the court injunction. Tony, Sophia, and Matilda would remain at the lodge, studying the maps in search of more information that could help. But as Helen and Clara were about to leave, Miguel began to cry inconsolably. It was a different cry, almost like a warning. Clara tried to soothe him, but for the first time since she had found him, nothing she did seemed to work. He senses something, Matilda said softly. Children have that sensitivity. And as if to confirm the housekeeper's words, a distant thunder cut through the sky, announcing a storm that no one had predicted. A storm that could change everything, or destroy the last vestiges of hope that remained for the Mendez and Mendoza families. The storm that was forming on the horizon seemed like a foreshadowing of what was to come. Helen and Clara drove in silence along the road that led to company headquarters, while Miguel finally slept in the back seat, exhausted. From crying so much, the first raindrops began to fall, making visibility increasingly difficult. At the lodge, Tony, Sophia, and Matilda continued to study the old maps, discovering more details about the complex system of underground waters that their families had protected for generations. Edward had left to get the court injunction, promising to return as quickly as possible. "Look at this," Sophia said, pointing to a specific marking on the map. "The spring under the chapel. It's not the only one. There are 7 other points marked, forming a kind of star around the property." "The sacred points," Matilda murmured, recognizing the pattern. "Your mother used to talk about them. Places where the water sprung up naturally, creating small oases in the midst of the dry lands. A particularly strong thunderclap made the windows of the lodge shake." Tony looked worriedly at the dark sky. "This storm," he began, but Matilda interrupted him. "It's not natural," she said firmly. "It's like that night, 100 years ago, when Augusto Mendez made his promise. The land responds to the crucial moments in our history." Meanwhile, at company headquarters, Helen and Clara had managed to enter without arousing suspicion. The building was practically empty due to the time and the approaching storm. Miguel slept peacefully in Clara's arms, while Helen guided them through the familiar hallways to Ricardo's office. "The documents should be in the safe," Clara whispered, remembering the times she had been there with Thomas. "He always kept everything important there." Helen approached the painting that hid the safe, her hands trembling slightly as she removed it. "Do you know the combination?" Clara nodded, carefully passing Miguel to Helen. "It's Thomas's birthday. Ricardo never changed it, even after—" Her voice faltered, but her fingers moved with certainty over the numeric keypad. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing stacks of carefully organized documents. Meanwhile, at the police station, Ricardo watched the storm from his cell window. His mother's words echoed in his mind, along with all the revelations of that night. That's when he noticed something strange in the rainwater that ran down the glass. It had a slightly bluish, almost phosphorescent hue. "My God," he murmured, remembering the stories his grandmother told about the night of Augusto Mendez's pact. "It's happening again." Back at the office, Clara and Helen had found not only the construction documents, but much more. They were signed confessions, evidence of bribery, and most importantly, Augusto Mendez's original will, which Ricardo had hidden all these years. "This is more than we needed," Helen said, putting everything in her bag. "Let's get out of here." But when they turned to leave, they found their way blocked. Pedro Salvatore, the company's head of security and Ricardo's right-hand man, was standing in the doorway, a somber expression on his face. "The ladies shouldn't be here," he said, his hand moving slowly towards the phone on his desk. It was at that moment that Miguel woke up. His eyes opened, so similar to Thomas's, and he smiled at Pedro, a smile so pure and innocent that it made the man freeze. "That smile," Pedro murmured, his hand falling to his side, "just like Thomas's when he was a baby." Clara took a step forward, still protecting her son. "You knew Thomas when he was a baby?" Pedro nodded slowly, unexpected tears glistening in his eyes. I helped raise him. Ricardo was always busy, and his mother, after she was gone." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of the increasingly heavy rain outside. Helen, still holding the documents, watched the scene without daring to move. "Pedro," Clara said softly, "you know that what's happening here is wrong. The chapel, the aquifer, Thomas would never have allowed it. The man closed his eyes for a moment, as if fighting an internal battle. When he opened them again, there was determination in his gaze. "Go," he said simply. "I never saw you here." Meanwhile, at the lodge, Tony had made a shocking discovery on the old maps. "Here," he pointed to Matilda and Sophia. "The text is almost erased, but it seems that the spring under the chapel is not just a source of water. It's a point of connection to something much bigger." "What do you mean?" Sophia asked, leaning in to see better. "Augusto Mendez wrote that the water that springs there is different," Matilda explained, her eyes scanning the old notes. "It has special properties. That's why our lands have always been so fertile. That's why our region has never suffered from droughts like the others." A new thunderclap shook the lodge, and through the windows they could see that the rain that was falling now actually had a supernatural bluish glow. It was then that Tony's phone rang. It was Edward. "I got the injunction," he said, his voice urgent. "But there's something happening at the chapel. The machines, they started the work ahead of schedule. They're there now." Tony's heart stopped. "But the demolition wasn't supposed to start for 3 days." "Someone must have warned them that we were investigating," Edward replied. "They're trying to demolish before we can stop it legally." At that exact moment, Helen and Clara ran into the lodge, soaked by the bluish rain. Miguel was awake in his mother's arms, his wide eyes reflecting the supernatural glow of the storm. "We got the documents," Helen said, handing the bag to Tony. "But we heard on the radio, the chapel. We need to go there," Sophia declared, already moving towards the door. "Now." The group left immediately, facing the storm that seemed to intensify with each passing minute. When they arrived at the chapel, the scene they found was surreal. Large machines surrounded the historic building, their lights cutting through the darkness of the storm. Edward was already there, trying to argue with the workers. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Miguel, still in Clara's arms, stretched out his little hands towards the chapel. At the same instant, the bluish rain began to converge on the site, forming small glowing streams that ran towards the building. The workers stopped, watching the supernatural phenomenon in astonishment. From the ground, ancient springs began to sprout, forming circles of crystalline water around the chapel. "The sacred points," Matilda whispered. "They're awakening." The water continued to sprout, stronger and stronger, forming a natural barrier around the chapel. The machines began to sink into the now wet earth, forcing the workers to retreat. It was at that moment that a car skidded into the mud. Ricardo got out of it, still wearing his prison clothes, followed by the police officers who had apparently understood the gravity of the situation and had brought him there. "Stop!" he shouted to the workers. "Stop everything! This chapel, this place, is sacred." The rain began to gradually diminish, but the water that had sprung from the ground remained, shining with that supernatural bluish light. Miguel let out a joyful laugh, the first any of them had heard, and the sound seemed to echo throughout the entire property. Edward approached Ricardo, holding the documents that Helen and Clara had recovered. "It's all here," he said. "All the evidence. We can fix this." Ricardo nodded, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Yes, we can, and we must. For Thomas, for Miguel, for all who will come after." The storm had completely passed now, leaving behind a clear, starry sky. The water that was springing from the ground began to recede slowly, returning to the underground springs, but leaving the soil around the chapel greener and more alive than ever before. Matilda approached the group, her eyes shining with ancient wisdom. "The promise has been fulfilled," she said softly. "Not in the way we expected, but in the way it was meant to be, through love, not hate, through union, not division." Miguel, still in Clara's arms, let out another small laugh, reaching his little hands to touch his grandfather's face. Ricardo openly wept then, for the first time in years, feeling the weight of decades of bitterness and revenge finally leave his shoulders. Tony embraced Helen, while Sophia and Edward approached Clara and Miguel. There, under the starry sky, in front of the old chapel that held so many secrets and promises, the Mendez and Mendoza families finally reunited. Not as enemies, but as one family, united by love and the commitment to protect something much greater than themselves. The crystalline water that still glowed softly around the chapel was a constant reminder of the pact made so long ago, a pact that would now be honored not by obligation, but by choice. And Miguel, the little miracle that had brought all the truth to light, slept peacefully in his mother's arms, his sleep lulled by the promise of a future where love had finally conquered hate, where truth had finally found its way through the shadows of the past. Augusto Mendez's ancient promise had been fulfilled, not only in the union of the families, but in the protection of the true treasure that ran silently beneath their lands. And in the generations to come, the story would be told not as a saga of hatred and revenge, but as a testament to the power of love to heal old wounds and build new beginnings.